To talk further about this issue and the increasing threat of the Islamic State, I'm joined by Jim Walsh. He's an international security expert and a research associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Jim, always good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Well, let me throw this at you. You just heard our report, Robert Nagila, talking about Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab. We're talking about the IS. There's terror going on in China, South Asia. There's explosion of violence in the Middle East. You hear the British Prime Minister saying that there's an imminent threat, not imminent, but there is the threat there in the UK. We've got Canadians, folks, Brits, people from the US, sympathizers joining the IS. Stitch it all together. What is this telling us?
Well, it's a lot to stitch together, and I think your report, the last report we heard from Robert, does some important things. It points to the similarities. There are similarities across these groups, across Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and the Islamic State. But there are also important differences here, and not all these things are the same. So in Boko Haram, for example, I think they're very, what do they share in common? They're all brutal. They've engaged in acts that we would all agree are an abomination and intolerable. They are different, though, in that Boko Haram, for example, really is focused on Nigeria. It doesn't really have a broader international program. The Islamic State or ISIL or ISIS, whatever you call it, on the other hand, operating in Syria, has expanded to Iraq and really does have claims that I think are much broader. And they've been able also, because of their the successes, recent successes, to bolster their resources. They have cash and weapons and things that the other groups do not enjoy as much. So there are some similarities ideologically, in terms of the brutality, but there are important differences, and not all these things are the same.
We heard in Robert's report basically, I guess you could just sum it up, the lack of hope, that there aren't a lot of jobs, unemployment, that's fueling a lot of this. Is there a way to reduce this or reverse this by giving some of these people opportunities, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, and that's an important point to make. But I really would go back to what Robert was saying in that set piece. Part of it is poverty, but we've always had poverty, sadly. And if poverty was the cause, we would have a lot more terrorism because there are a lot of poor folks. I think the key that was identified in that last piece is governance. That is to say, governments, whether they're in poor countries or rich countries, if they cannot govern and meet the needs of their people, if they're a failed state, if they are alienating large numbers of their population because of religious bias or other sorts of bias, if they're just failing their citizens, then that creates a vacuum that allows a terrorist to seize territory and to try to win converts. So I think that's the critical link between all these things. Not so much that people are poor, which is bad, but that the governments are incompetent, and by their incompetence create openings and opportunities for terror groups.
What happened to the Arab Spring? I mean, there seemed to be so much hope surrounding that. A lot of folks thought this would moderate this sort of thing. Actually, it's exploded more, it seems like.
I think that's right. I mean, we don't know how it's all going to look like 20 years from now, but, Mike, I think, who could deny what you're saying? That's right. And I think it sort of ties into what we were just talking about, because you had old regimes in the Middle East, dictatorships that had governed from a minority position, often imposing rule on majorities. Then those crumbled and went away. The U.S. invaded Iraq. There are other things, in Syria, in Egypt, and elsewhere. But what happened was the governments in place, which were bad, uniformly bad, then were gone. And so then you have, a vacuum and instability, and the old government was bad, but the new governments are not able to sort of get their act together or govern in a way that produces stability. And so that becomes a breeding ground for all these other groups to take advantage of that opportunity and leap into the fray.
Jim, there used to be this running narrative here in Washington that everything kind of hinged on a deal between Israel and the Palestinians, and that was the key to Middle East peace. That doesn't seem to be a factor now, does it?
Wow, that is a great question. I've not heard others ask that question. I would say this, again, to break it up into smaller pieces. If we had peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis tomorrow, we would still have ISIS. We would still have other issues that we confront. But unless the Israelis and the Palestinians can settle their differences and come to a negotiated settlement, which doesn't look very good right now, then we're going to continue to have problems. We're talking about two separate problems. They're both important. Unless we solve both of them, that is to say, sort of governments falling apart in the Arab states and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then we're not going to have stability in the Middle East.
All right, Jim Walsh joining us from Boston. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Just days after more than 3 tons of cocaine is seized in Peru, hundreds of police officers are now under surveillance for possible drug trafficking. 300-plus officers are actively being watched, according to Peru's counter-narcotics chief, while 112 cops across the country are already under investigation. Peru is now the world's #1 cocaine-producing country since overtaking Colombia. That was 2 years ago.